tear, it falls and hits the ground. A tree, it falls without a sound. A bird, it calls and sends you home. A man, he sits in the cold all alone.
Hi, Lindsey. Thank you so much for joining me at the Joy Sunflowers. Please introduce yourself a little bit.
Thanks, Ella. My name is Lindsey Henke, and I'm a psychotherapist specializing in maternal mental health, specifically perinatal loss and the subsequent pregnancy that follows. I founded Pregnancy After Loss Support in 2014, 3 months after my subsequent daughter Zoe was born, after the stillbirth of my first child and daughter Nora in 2012. So that's how I came to this work. And it's been 10 years in December since my daughter Nora was stillborn. And what I focus on now is helping other parents go through a loss and then a subsequent pregnancy.
Yeah, and I can tell you that is a tricky time because I'm 22 weeks right now, and that is after 2 losses. So I'm kind of like struggling some days.
Yeah, it really is. And, back in 2012, when the baby loss community and the perinatal loss community was kind of budding online, it was a lot of bloggers. And then they're turned into this big blog called Still Standing at the time, where it was mostly for bereavement. And then when I became subsequently pregnant like you in 2013, I wrote for Pregnancy and Newborn magazine. So I'm from America, the Midwest. So all of the nonprofit is an American nonprofit. And then the Pregnancy and Newborn magazine was an American magazine at the time. It still is. And so I wrote for my subsequent pregnancy weekly as a blogger for this magazine. And what I found is that, like, in the bereavement world at the time, nobody was ready for the joy that comes with a subsequent pregnancy. But at the same time, in the normal pregnancy world, nobody was ready to hear about loss. So that's why I created Pregnancy After Loss Support as like an online magazine, the baby center for pregnancy after loss, because it's so challenging, right? It's like this holding hope and fear, grief and joy. And it's really scary time. It's like, I'm sure you've heard other people say, it's like being in a car accident and the person you're driving and the passenger next to you dies, and then getting back into that car for 9 months and having to do the same thing and expecting a different result, right? The definition of insanity. So now in my work and my private practice as a therapist, I help parents get through that process, because it is so much trauma, so much grief, and then also holding that hope as well. So I'm holding hope for you if you can't hold hope.
That's
okay.
That's so beautiful. And you're right, like the sort of mixture of emotions is so complex, because you're going back into that car, you're getting back into that position, and you're hoping and praying for a different result, and you don't know if that result's going to happen, because we're not guaranteed anything. So
and your innocence is broken, right? Especially after 2 losses.
Oh yeah.
You go into this thinking everything will be normal, and then you're basically blindsided by the fact that none of it is normal for you. And some people, it gets harder and harder. Like, they're like, okay, 1 loss, if it's early loss, we normalize that, like, okay, it happened once, but then when it happens again, it's this reoccurrent trauma, or like stillbirth or preterm labor that results in infant death. You're just like, I don't know if I can say, holy crap. I don't know. I didn't know that could happen, because, like, we don't talk about these things, at least in America. It's changing in the last 10 years, which I think is great. Even stillbirth rates have been reduced in Australia, in the UK. The US has some work to catch up on that. But, if you're in a typical pregnancy or prenatal appointments in America, nobody says like, oh, well, let's watch out for stillbirth, or let's watch out for infant death, when you're pregnant, or like preterm labor. Let's just be aware of it, but nobody actually tells you the reality of it.
Yeah, they really don't. And there's no preparation. I mean, in Australia, there's no preparation either. They sort of just, when you find out you're miscarrying, they're just like, oh yeah, you're going to miscarry. What do you want to do? Here's your options. You pick one. They're like, okay, well, great. Here's your pills, or here's your, go home, and it's like a heavy period. And that's pretty much all you get. Like,
it's not a heavy period. It's like literally giving birth.
Yeah, it's a proper birth. And I think, you know, what you do is so important in that, because yeah, like so many of us don't even realize that it's an actual full-on birth. Like you have, a lot of women have contractions. I had contractions, and you deliver. Like I delivered a sack. So, you know, that was a delivery, be it a baby or egg thing. But yeah, it's amazing how the medical industry hasn't moved forward in that way, because you'd expect them to have made those strides. But
Yeah, but they really haven't. And I don't know if COVID pushed some of that back, but I know pre-COVID, when I do these interviews and we talk about early losses, like one of the biggest disenfranchisement of grief is the fact that we don't acknowledge these early losses as like a wanted baby, or like this is a traumatic event about a child someone lost that they wanted to have and hold. And also like the way we do it in the medical field in America is like you can go to the ER, but nobody at the ER actually treats you like you're having a real medical event, and you're delivering a baby. And that's really, what's the word? It's disenfranchising your grief and invalidating your experience.
yeah, I always say it's dehumanizing. Like it's sort of downgrading life. And I think that is a problem within our society, that we downgrade life and we don't put that importance on it, you know, depending on whether it's, you know, oh, it's too early, or you were, well, that person, you know, they don't really have a life, so their life's not important.
Or there must, like what I hear a lot as a stillbirth mom is like, there must have been something wrong with the baby, right? And that's all for us to like, and there wasn't anything wrong with her. It's just all for us as humans to distance ourselves from that experience, that trauma, that grief, so that like, oh, that won't happen to us, right?
Yeah, I mean, my first loss, I said to my husband, it must have been my stress, it must have been this, it must have been that. And he goes, well, a lot of first losses, you know, like it's just genetics, like it's just like how things go together, and it could have just been a genetic anomaly. And I was like, great, okay. And that sort of made me feel a little bit like, okay, there's a reason, kind of. But then we had a second loss, so then it was like, you know, because usually it happens with one, but then, you know, unless you've got something wrong, and we've already had 3 healthy kids, so I was like, this doesn't make any sense to me. So it was just, yeah, weird. But enough about me. Let's go into your story and how you came into the field, because I know you said sort of a little bit about it, but yeah, let's start from the beginning. You know, did you always want to have kids? Or was it something that you kind of moved into?
No, I did not always want to have kids. And my kids now, who were born after Nora was stillborn, are going to be 9 and 7 in the spring. But so they're 8 and 6 right now, and they're lovely. But parenting is hard. And I think that's something we don't talk about too, is like, and I'll get to my story, but parenting after a loss is hard too. A lot of my moms will be postpartum and they're like, I feel so bad. And I felt this way too. I'm like, I'm never going to complain about parenting or postpartum or sleepless nights or any of that, because my first child was stillborn and died. So I'm like, oh, those moms who complain about that, they're just not grateful. And then I become a mom, you know, and I realized like you can hold both. Like you can be grateful your children are here, and you can admit that it's really, really hard to be a parent.
Yeah. You can be suffering and still be grateful that they're there and they're making you suffer.
Yeah, I love the way you put that. So yeah, and I think we kind of get that experience too ahead of the process of being a parent after a loss. If for you and for people who have living children, I think they experience that sooner. But for people who don't have living children at the time, we get that experience when we hold that grief and joy during the subsequent pregnancy, right? Like I can be sad and suffering and be in grief that I lost my baby, and still hopeful and have moments of joy for the baby that's coming.
Yeah, definitely. Like as soon as I had those losses, I looked at my kids and I was just like, wow, I wasn't grateful enough. Like I didn't feel blessed enough. Like you're a miracle, you know. And you do get a flood of emotions like when you already have the kids. And I think, yeah, there's definitely a difference between having kids and then sort of having a subsequent pregnancy and kind of dealing with that as well, but just on its own without kids in the mix there.
And they are miracles. Even now I'm like, oh my God, you're so amazing. You're like the best thing ever created. and you're driving me nuts. So both can be true after you've lost a child as well, right?
Oh yeah.
I just like to validate that for people. So I did not want to have kids, but then I met a wonderful man who I wanted to have kids with. And I was like 29. And then I turned 30 2 weeks before my loss, when Nora was stillborn in December 30th, 2012 at 40 weeks and 4 days. So we actually woke up thinking we were going to deliver her alive. And we went to the hospital to be told she had died in the night as I was sleeping. So the night before, she always moved. She was a very active baby. In my subsequent pregnancies, I had an anterior placenta that's in the front, right? And with Nora, it didn't. So I was able to feel her move a lot, unlike my subsequent pregnancies, which was also really anxiety provoking when your placenta is in the front during your subsequent pregnancies and you have to feel your baby's movement on the side. It's kind of like another cruel hurdle you have to jump through. But her movement had slowed down somewhat the night before. And I falsely believed the rumors that were trying to, reverse people's understanding of that those are deadly rumors that babies slow down before birth, because it's not true. And I was like, oh, she's just running out of room. Also not true. And when we got to the hospital at 3 a.m, so that was like 9 o'clock at night, and I went to bed, she moved about 4 times, but not her normal amount and not in the same kind of strength or consistency that we recommend now with, movement tracking, which Australia has a great recommendation on how to do that. And I think that they really lead the way in changing it from like kick counts to really understanding the frequency, the consistency, the time that is your baby's normal. But I didn't know any of that 10 years ago. And so I went in and they tried to find her heartbeat, which, at every other appointment doesn't take very long. And she said, sometimes the nurse said, sometimes it's just hard to find the baby's heartbeat. And she left for 2 minutes to get the doctor. And I knew at that moment something was wrong. And my husband said, it will be okay. And he took my hand in the hospital bed, and the young, late 20s male doctor came back, and he was lovely. But they rolled in the ultrasound machine and he put the goo on my belly and the wand, and her picture came on the screen, but instead of being a video, she was a portrait, right? And instead of where the sound was supposed to be, there was silence. And he searched around for a long time. And I just screamed in my mind, like, I know something's wrong. Just say it, just say it. And then he said the words we all hear, which is, I'm sorry, there's no heartbeat. And that's when everything changed. And, I instantly hated this doctor, even though he was wonderful, because I wanted to direct my anger at someone. They didn't know what to do. They stood there, the doctor and the nurse, and I asked them for a minute. My husband then cried on my belly. And he even asked the doctor, like, well, how do we fix this? Thinking that since she wasn't, she was still inside of me, that she could somehow become alive. Like, I also think when you're that young, you still have this innocence that medicine can save people. And I think that's changed a little bit after the pandemic, and we've seen some of the cracks in our system. But also, like when you don't learn about stillbirth and pregnancy loss at your prenatal appointments, then what happens is you don't realize that it still happens in the 21st century. Like, you think it happens in the 1800s, not now. So then I had like a 12-hour labor. Our family came. I delivered her. They all met her grandparents, my husband's aunt and my husband's cousin that happened to be in town. And cuddle cots weren't really a thing yet, so we didn't spend a bunch of time with her. But we spent enough time with her until she started to change color, and that's as much as I could handle. There's things now I would go back and do differently. Like, I would have spent more time with her, maybe. I would have had... We had Now I Lay Me Down to Sleep come, and they took pictures of me and my husband with her, and of Nora, of course. And she was a beautiful baby. But I wish I would have had, them take pictures of the grandparents, which I never did. And I wish I didn't have the strength, which, when people say I have all these regrets, I'm like, yeah, I do too. And the thing is you did the best you could at the time with who you were at the time. You know, you were doing what was right for you and your baby. And that's what I like to think about my past self, right? Like, I wasn't able to dress her. I abdicated the responsibility to the nurse. I wasn't able to bathe her. But those are some things I wish I would have done. And at the same time, I know, like, at the moment with my whole world turned upside down, I just wasn't capable of it. And that's okay. And both can be true, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, you know, going through that is traumatic, and you can't put it on yourself that, oh, well, you know, wish I'd done this, because yeah, you're right. The person you were at that point is very different from the person you are now. And you can look back and go, oh, I wish I'd done that. I would have done that. But yeah, that person is very different, you know?
Yeah. And that person did the best they could with, like, your world totally being torn apart. And I try to remind people of that. And people are like, well, how don't you carry guilt that you knew her movements were slowing down and you didn't go in? And I think it's just that, like, I wasn't educated, you know, like, I was falsely informed, and I'm going to extend compassion to that person, because there's no reason to carry around guilt. Otherwise, it's just not how I want to live moving forward. Do I wish I would have done something different? Sure. Yes.
So many people go in for that. So many people go in for that, like, reduced movement, and then the baby's fine. Everything's fine. Like, there's so many things, you know. I mean, you could have gone into the doctors, like into the hospital, and they could have gone, oh, yeah, the baby's fine. Like, there's a heartbeat, you know, everything's fine. The baby's, you know, good. You can go home. And that could have happened. And you don't know. Like, I've heard of many women being sent home, you know, they said reduced movement. They had a look and they went, yeah, it's fine. Everything's fine. And it wasn't, you know?
Yeah.
So you don't know. Like, you could have gone in and they could have sent you home, and the same thing would have happened.
Yeah. And actually, by the time that I had reduced movements, they've even said that, like, so Nora died within, like, based on how she looked when she was born, within like 12 to 24 hours. So it wasn't 12 hours because we had delivered her, but they said it was in the last 24 hours. But the reality is like, so bodies kind of move after death as well. They make sporadic movements. So she could have already been dead too, you know, and I missed it. And that's just the reality of stillbirth. And that's actually what makes, like, subsequent pregnancy so scary, is you're like, well, how do I stay attuned to my baby? You know, with any type of loss, like, how do I make sure I keep them safe? And part of it is just hanging your hat on hope, right? Like, I can do the best I can. And now I've learned that I'm not immune to these things, to life's awful blows, you know?
Yeah. And I think it's holding on to that hope and just kind of understanding that you don't have control and you won't know necessarily. Like, that, I think that's been quite hard for quite a few women, where they've gone in for that scan and they've been told, you know, the baby was gone like a week ago or like 3 weeks ago. And they're like, well, how did I not know that? How did I not feel that? How did I not, you know? And you can't know. It's just,
well, yeah, depending on the different gestations and, like, where the placenta is and all those things. Like, also, if you have living children, like, you have a life to live, right? And it's hard to always be totally attuned with your body. And at the same time, you know, the baby might not really be kicking yet. If you're like 20 weeks, you might not feel the baby's movements as much. And so I think the way I like to move forward with myself and clients is about that past self, is basically like, if it was your friend, you would extend compassion, right? So let's extend self-compassion to our past self, that we did the best we could with what we had, and we didn't want our babies to die, right? So we can be kind to our past selves.
yeah, that's what my husband said. That he said, because I sort of said all these reasons that I lost the baby, and he said, well, you don't know, and you're not going to know. And I was like, no, I do know it was this. And he goes, no, you don't know, and you're not going to know, and you have to deal with that. You have to deal with the fact you're not going to know. He's very blunt about it, and that you're not going to know, and you just, sorry, you have to deal with it. And I was like, okay.
Yeah. And I think it's that uncertainty that we as humans have such a hard time with. And I think even more so for, like, a certain personality type that like to have answers, that like to have control. And I think we've evolved to have more of that in the last 100 years. Like, we don't live with as much uncertainty naturally. So when we have to learn that we do actually live with a lot of uncertainty, which is part of losing that innocence, it becomes hard to adjust to that reality.
Exactly.
And I think just becoming a parent, you kind of learn that,
Mm.
right? Because once your child, I was going to say outside of you, but even inside of me, I didn't have as much control over what would happen, but like, it's a different being, right? Like you don't have control, and sometimes you just have to trust uncertainty.
Yeah. I mean, you have more control over your physical, like a living, on earth children than you do with a baby that's inside of you. Yes, it's inside of you.
Yeah. It's so crazy.
Anything.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. That's just crazy though, too.
Yeah. You're like, but it's in my body. Yeah. You can't control it.
Yeah. Right. And I think also too, with like human development that we talk about in psychology, which is that like, I think for couples, losing a child is the most devastating loss there is. And I think it's for couples sometimes in our society, Westernized society, it's the first kind of huge traumatic loss that parents might experience together, right? Like you're at an age where hopefully you haven't lost your parents yet. Or maybe as a couple, you haven't experienced a huge loss financially or in your family. A lot of people haven't. And then you go into this and it's like your innocence is broken with the worst type of loss, which is losing a child. So it's kind of like your first point of facing devastation in that way too.
Yeah. And it either draws you closer together or it kind of pushes you apart because you're just having to cope with something, that you've never had to deal with before. And that is trauma and just devastation. Yeah. And one of my friends said it's bewilderment.
Bewilderment.
So good. Like, but it's bewildering. I was like, yes, it's a good word.
Yeah. It's a great word. So yeah, a lot of my clients worry about that too, like the couple's relationship, and I did as well. And I know the statistic goes back and forth, and it has for the last 10 years. Like, what is it? Like 50% of couples will get divorced to experience a loss is one statistic that's thrown around. What I remind my clients though, is like what I've seen in my practice is it's couples who already had cracks in the foundation of the relationship have the hardest time getting over that hurdle or that statistic as a hurdle, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because it just opens up the cracks more because obviously when you're emotional, you're just kind of, those highs are higher, those lows are lower, and then the cracks get bigger.
And you're also individual people, right? And we also know if you're in a heterosexual relationship, men and women grieve differently. But even if you're in a same-sex relationship, like one person was the birthing person and one person was the partner, and you have a different relationship with that child that you lost. And that can be harder too, right? To traverse that bridge between each other. And I think we also all have our style of grieving, and we have to honor that and take space as a couple. I always talk to couples about how it's like you're walking down this path of right after a loss, and you're kind of in the same path in the woods. Everything, you've had the same experience mostly, right? And you're the two that have lost this, are the closest to the baby that you have lost. So you get each other. But then eventually you kind of diverge in the woods and you go down other paths. And that's okay. And we want to have space for that in our grief, but we want to kind of try to reconnect as touchstones sometimes, so that we can say like we're in this together, but then let each other explore their own grief and then come back.
Yeah, because you do have to explore it on your own for a time, because otherwise you don't know how you feel as an individual. If you're both talking to each other about the same situation, you might like try and take on each other's grief, and that's not going to help you. You've got to individualize it first. Understand where
people express their emotions in different ways, right?
Yeah, totally. That makes a lot of sense. So with Nora, did you say there was loss before that, or that they were living birth children before that, or after?
So Nora was my first child, and she was stillborn at 40 weeks. And then She died from E. coli infection, which is extremely rare. And it went ascending up the vaginal canal, and they had to break my waters in order to deliver her. And so there was like a microscopic tear. Like there was like so many like why like I won the shitty luck lottery of like so many statistics that were unlikely. And she still died. So they said she shouldn't have died because there was basically two enclosed sacs, but somehow the E. coli infection, which we carry in our gut, but it came up ascending through the vaginal canal for some reason, got through a microscopic tear. So they actually said if I would have gone in earlier, she would have already had what was like in utero pneumonia because it had like gotten into her lungs, and she most likely wouldn't have survived. And we could have had her been born, but it would have been I think all losses are awful. But I do think after working with clients, there's like trauma on top of trauma that can make losses even more unbearable or just sadder and sadder. And sometimes I think we compare losses to make ourselves feel like, well, at least when you can at least yourself, but other people can't at least you, right? You're like trying to find a sense of solace in your grief. But like, I've had clients who've had not from E. coli infections, but similar experience where the baby kind of died in delivery. But then they're on life support. So it's like two letting goes, right? Which is like trauma on top of trauma. Or clients who've had like life-limiting diagnoses given at the mid-pregnancy scan. And then that's like the onset of the trauma and the loss story. But then the trauma is amplified by decisions that have to be made or about holding the baby and delivering the baby, So I think one thing that happened, we didn't have to like make any choices. It was decided for us. And I think in some of that, it makes the trauma less complex. It's still traumatic. But I think the more and more you have like these traumatic experiences on top, like I actually had a wonderful healthcare team at the hospital, but I've had people go in who had the same story of me, like their baby died overnight. They're going to deliver a stillborn baby, and the hospital staff added another layer of trauma on top with how they handled that, right? And that they didn't treat them humanely or kindly or compassionately as a couple or the baby. Like all the nurses treated Nora as if she was a living baby. They sang to her. That always makes me cry. They sang to her. They wrapped her in clothes. They laid her on my chest. They everybody treated her as if she was human. And I think some of my clients, unfortunately, have not gotten that experience. And that's another layer of how like the trauma can be complex and made complex if we have more traumatic events happen or if we're not treated kindly in our experience.
That sounds so beautiful that they did that. That's so lovely.
Yeah, I was very lucky, and I get very sad when other people aren't.
Yeah, because most of the ones I've spoken about more, I mean, a lot of the ladies that had sort of the later stillborns, they did get treated better. It was the kind of stillborns before full term that were not so nice,
Yeah, but that adds to like, I think we're talking about too is like what I've noticed is there's the grief and there's the trauma. And when you add more and more to the trauma, it's harder as a therapist than to get to the grief. And the grief is normal. It's natural. It's what you need to be feeling. We need to move the trauma out of the way though, so that we can access that, because the trauma inhibits us from going deeper into feeling that grief. And that grief, like I say, is just love, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And but the trauma, the trauma is such a big thing. I mean, if you found out you were going to lose the baby before, or you'd lost the baby, and then you've got this massive wait time, that waiting is so traumatic. Like I decided to go natural, like get rid of let it all pass naturally. They said it would be like 3 weeks, and it took 2 months virtually, and I was when is this going to happen? I started bleeding, and the bleeding just kept going and going and going. And it was like little bits. And I was like, come on, And then one night I just started feeling contractions. And because I'd already had kids, I knew exactly what I was going through. And I was like, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Are you serious? I actually got annoyed and kind of angry. And and then I just went through it right in front of me, actually, where I am. But yes, so that was like, it went from May 5th, which was my birthday, all the way to June 20th, which is the due date of this one that I'm pregnant right now. I know. So I'm like layers on layers on layers. So I totally understand what you're saying with the layers, because I'm like an onion at the moment with the trauma-y weirdness.
Yeah, so that brings up two things that I want to talk about. I want to talk about so pregnancy after loss support. A year ago, we made an app for the subsequent pregnancy, so you didn't have to go into baby center if you're in America, and you can look at all the milestones, but still learn about the unique emotional experience of a subsequent pregnancy, because there's milestones you're talking about. Like the ultrasound appointment brings up trauma reaction, because in our seat we go into a scenery that is familiar, and a lot of people either knew they were having a loss or their loss was confirmed in some kind of ultrasound environment, right? Or at the clinic or at the A&E or hospital or whatever you call it, whatever country you're from, ER. And so, just trauma is stored in the body and our senses remember that. So like we talk about how do we deal with that in the app, and how do we deal with sex disappointment or conflict around the sex of the subsequent baby's gender, if that's something that triggers you to think like magical thinking thoughts like I did, like I wanted a boy in my subsequent pregnancy because I'm like, then the outcome will be different, right? That made no sense. But that made me feel like it was a different pregnancy. I had a girl, and it was a different pregnancy, but that's what your brain does during some of these subsequent pregnancy things, especially when you approach the anniversary of your loss or the anniversary of your due date. And then also the gestational week you lost the baby in your subsequent pregnancy is a big deal as well as a milestone, because you have, again, that magical thinking that something might happen when that's not necessarily true, but that's how you feel, because that's the narrative in the story you remember. Like for me, as I got closer to the birth, because I'd never had living children before, and this happens a lot with people in my situation, all I knew about birth was death. So I thought we were approaching when we were pregnant with Zoe, approaching the end of her life, because that's when Nora died, right? Birth equal death. So I had to like rewrite this new narrative, but your brain pulls from past memories as future experiences. And so I kept thinking like, this is going to happen again. This is going to happen again, because that's the only framework I had. I know this happens for people who've also had losses as well, are living births and then had losses as well. And then another thing is being part of the community, you learn everybody's story and then you apply that to you. So even though I had a late term loss, I was still scared of early loss, because I'm like, oh, this friend of mine, she's had 3 early losses and hasn't had a baby yet. That could be me. Or even like, I didn't thankfully struggle with infertility, but apparently secondary infertility is something that can happen. And then I was like, well, of course fate would F me in that way. Like you start to take on all your other friends, lost mom friends' losses. Or I also thought like I had a friend who their baby died of a heart defect, and I'm like, the anatomy scan, like something's going to be wrong with her anatomy, so I think that's pretty normal. One of the best ways of healing is a loaded term, but like of feeling less alone in your grief is through connection, which is what you're doing with this, which is great. But one of the downsides of connection is also learning all the ways babies can die.
Yeah, all the things that can go wrong. And it's true. I just had the anatomy scan, and I just laid there feeling numb. Even though I saw a living baby, I just laid there like, I was like, well, yeah, it's there now. But
exactly,
like not guaranteed anything. And yeah, doing this, I'm hearing all these stories, late term, early, mid, the whole shebang and all the different things. And I'm like, well, I'm worried about everything now. And I said it get easier once you have the baby, and so many women have told me, no, you're worried that like after having the baby as well, like you check their breathing all the time. I was like, well, I already do that with like all my kids and my husband now since losing the 2 babies. I do that like more so than I did before, and it was something I did before as well.
Well, I think as someone who is certified in perinatal postpartum and perinatal maternal mental health, you know, like that is a normal, somewhat like seeking to make sure the baby is okay is a normal parental instinct, right? Like, because we're supposed to take care of newborns, we're supposed to check in on them. But I think it is amplified. So it's anxiety in a subsequent pregnancy is expected, but it can become pathological basically because of the trauma, which is neither good nor bad. It just is that like you've experienced this horrible trauma. And like I went to the labor and delivery so many times because I was afraid something happened, right? And I knew a lot of my thoughts were irrational, but at the time I needed the reassurance. And what we say actually is an anxiety treatment, if you weren't subsequently pregnant, we would ask you to kind of avoid that. It's actually what women need during their subsequent pregnancy, is that reassurance that the baby's okay. That anxiety from a subsequent pregnancy can linger into postpartum. And also, you know, that checking to make sure they're breathing. And I think it gets easier as they get older and you start to have more and more experiences where like you wake up each day and everything's okay. Right? Like we have hiccups that we make it through. And then you create this narrative kind of exposure, like, oh, life can be a little bit more or a little less fragile, a little bit more reliable. But that takes time and it doesn't happen right away. And so, yeah, those women are correct. It can live on for a while. The other thing you talked about, though, is the normal grief reaction with your husband, which is typical. I started projecting my fear of loss again, which is like the anxiety component of grief, onto my husband as well. And I've seen clients do it. Like they're like, they didn't call when they were 10 minutes late from going out with their friends, you know, and did they die in a car accident? Or even projecting that on to your living children. Or if you don't have living children, like your pets, like I did, I was very anxious about my dog's health for a while. He was healthy for a long time, you know, so that's a normal experience of grief as well as like this anxiety component.
Yeah, I actually noted that the other day because my son like shut his thumb in the car door. He was fine, but it was like really quick and like it wasn't bad, but he's two and it happened and it freaked me out. I like reacted really poorly. Like just freaked out, ran around the car. I didn't get there quick enough because my husband was already there. But like I half hurt myself running around the car. But anyway, don't do that when you're 22 weeks pregnant, by the way. But so yeah, I ran around and freaking out. And you know, yeah, I had my reaction. My husband was just like, you know, freaking out's not going to help anyone. Like what? And I sat in the car and I was like, yeah, that's loss. That's like part of having lost the two babies, like
yeah,
because
the trauma response too, right?
It wasn't normal, like it was an overreaction for sure. And I told him that.
And so that's the hard part too.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, it lingers in the back of your mind and it shows up in those ways. Like I'm pretty fine with my kids, but like when they would get sick, so I think it's also about like sometimes about the type of loss you had. So like when they would get sick, specifically with like fevers, I had a fever when I lost Nora. I had the infection as well. And, you know, I'm triggered like, okay, I have no control over this. I know this triggers me. Like I wrote about it a couple of years later when my son was born. So he's 3.5 years after Nora died. And so he got at 9 months, he got influenza A. And I like freaked out. And I took him to the doctor and he had 105 fever and it's late at night. And my husband didn't go with me because he had to stay home with the other kid, with Zoe, who was a toddler. But I called him because we were at the doctor's for 3 hours and it was late and he didn't answer. And I must have called him like 40 times. And this is my anxiety coming up now, right? And finally he's like, you have to stop freaking out over everything. And I wrote about it. And I don't remember exactly what I said, but I said, but I can't let another kid die. You know, like, so that's where my guilt came out. Like, this is a big deal. Like, you need to show up for me because this is a trigger of how we lost Nora. Right. Yeah. So I totally relate to what you're saying. And I think it's pretty common. And everybody has their own triggers based on their loss.
Yeah. I mean, I'm actually a lot more sensitive when it comes to my 2-year-old, because I actually had food poisoning while I gave birth to him.
Yes.
And after you said about the E. coli, like it freaks me out because when he was born limp and really quiet. And so that could have been my reality if I hadn't have gone into labor, I think, because like I said, like he was so, yeah, it was terrifying that he was that limp. But yeah, and then I had 2 losses after that. So it's just trauma.
Yeah.
But no, it was.
And then I think getting back to sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, so getting back to what you said before reminds me of this, which is like, you kind of mentioned it and I wasn't able to go there yet, but like the anger you sometimes have at your body. I heard that in your story, and I had that in my story, and I hear that in a lot of women's stories. I don't know if you've seen the same thing.
Oh yeah, a lot of women. Yeah.
So like, a lot of what it is like, how do you reconcile that? And how do you trust your intuition again versus your anxiety, right? And that's about trusting your body. Or you talked about, the injustice of your body taking, what was it, 6 weeks to finally deliver the baby?
What's wrong with my body? I should know about babies and having babies and dealing with that because I'd already had some. What's going on? Like my body should have known I don't have a baby in there anymore. What are you talking about?
I know, right? And we get so angry at our bodies. Or the other injustice, when you talked about that, I talked like thinking about like when women's milk comes in, when there's no baby to provide the milk to, right? And it's like, you should know better, is what you think about your body. Like, you're the one who didn't protect the baby. Like, why do you still think this is happening? And I think that anger is pretty typical. But I think we have to kind of work through that anger in order to kind of move into that subsequent pregnancy, or just in general to live in our bodies for the rest of our life, which is hard to do.
Oh yeah. And how was your subsequent pregnancy? Because obviously, that was a lot of trauma that you underwent with Nora. So how did you go with that? You found out she was a girl. That wasn't what you wanted in terms of how you were feeling. So how did that go?
So realistically, like both of my subsequent pregnancies were perfect, just like my pregnancy with Nora. What wasn't perfect was the anxiety involved in it. The ghost of the previous pregnancy, or the shadow of Nora's pregnancy, lingered into theirs. So it was hard, and the closer and closer. So I see this in my clients as well. Like as they get closer, so if you have a second trimester loss to your loss week, or a first trimester loss, your anxiety increases around that week, kind of like I talked about with the app. So for mine, like every time we got closer to the baby being viable, it seemed like it was an even bigger loss if something were to happen. And then as we got closer to the due date, which was around the time I had my loss, it became terrifying, which is very common. Like I've seen women, if they lose their baby at 22 weeks, the anxiety actually goes up more around that period than it does. It kind of, for some, can settle a little bit and go back to the typical anxiety that was before the weeks of their previous loss. So that trauma memory just lingers. And then all that conflict you have with your body, and then also trying to live life while you're doing that. If it's either like raising children or going to work, like I was a therapist at the time, and like focusing on other people's concerns was hard when I was trying to like manage mine as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think writing was the thing that helped the most, and finding the community as well. I wrote weekly about my subsequent pregnancy, and I think it really helped express some of the emotions, and I think that helps get it out of the body. And there's a lot of studies that show that writing is one of the best healing techniques in grief and in other experiences as well.
Yeah, no, I've heard a lot of people say about writing and how they wrote, and that kind of helped them move through it and kind of just release that rather than having to hold on to it.
The other thing though that really is important about a subsequent pregnancy, sorry, I just forgot, I need to say this, is that connecting and making space for the baby that died is really important, or the babies that died. So that in honoring that was a baby, and that was a baby you lost and someone you wanted, and that they're still part of your family, actually creates space for the subsequent siblings to come in. And that is what, instead of like just saying like the replacement child, which is like a 1960s theory, like you're not replacing the baby. And that in the babies, because you have living children, right? And each subsequent child, even if they come after living children, is their own unique person. And that's same for your babies that died or your baby that died, as well as the children that come after. So like writing letters to the baby that died and then eventually writing letters to the baby that is coming is a way to differentiate too between the babies. And that can be helpful as well during a subsequent pregnancy. And having a great support team, that was helpful. Like a doctor, for me, having a consistent doctor, so I don't have to share my story over and over again. We had more appointments, like we had biophysical profiles, which was helpful towards the end, which I think a lot of people have. But like you said, those are good to know. But as soon as you walk out of the appointment, that reassurance kind of goes away.
Yeah. And
so
then
it's have, but
yeah.
Because all those things help.
Sorry, what were you saying?
All those things help. But yeah, like you said, you make it through the appointment, but then like you said, people that like, well, they went to appointment the day before and then they lost their baby.
Exactly. Yeah. And a lot of women feel that way. They go into their appointment, they get the scan, they see the baby, and they're like, oh, in the scan. But they say as soon as they walk out, as soon as that door closes, they're just like, still worried, still panicking.
Yeah. And I think that's typical.
Yeah, it is. And you're right. Every time you reach a certain milestone, you get that influx of anxiety, that little bit more than you had before. So like when I reached 6 weeks and 7 weeks, because that was when I had my first 2 losses, that was when I was like, oh, like I'm reaching that mark, like with this one. And then obviously talking to so many women, then it was like, okay, 20 weeks is a big deal for me now. And then, so, who knows when the next one will be, but I'm sure it'll be soon. But yeah,
pregnancies, it does seem to be like the 20 weeks and then like the viability and then the birth, right?
Yeah. Did you consider like getting a what do you call it? I've lost the word now. Like getting having the baby sooner, the inducement.
Oh, inducement. So yes. So Zoe was born at 37 weeks. And that was recommended not necessarily because the rate of stillbirth increases by a minuscule amount for all the population starting at 37 weeks. It goes up by 3% for those who've had a previous stillbirth. So I just had a client actually induce at 39 weeks. And she's had friends induce at like 37 or 38 after a stillbirth. I had a C-section though, because Nora actually had shoulder dystocia, which is something that would have happened if she was just born alive anyways. And it has a 10% increase of happening in every pregnancy after you have one, if even in a living birth. So just for more control, they suggested a C-section, but it wasn't because of the stillbirth. It was because of what Nora would have had even if she was born alive.
Right.
So it's where the shoulder gets stuck in the the cervix, in the birth canal.
Right. Yeah. No, I did. Yeah. Because some women like opt for that. They're like, I want an inducement. I don't want to wait the full term. Like I want it now.
A lot of women do actually, but some do wait, and there's a period to play with. With Liev, my son, we went to 38 weeks, so we pushed it a little bit farther. Because Zoe did have respiratory distress syndrome, and she was in a NICU for 5 days. So, it only happens to 15% of cases who deliver or have a C-sections at 37 weeks. But part of the reason too is probably because Zoe wasn't induced and it was a C-section. So like there is something about like squeezing the baby's lungs on the way out that helped with that. But
yeah. So with your son, you went to 38 weeks. Was that induced or was that just natural?
No, I had a subsequent C-section too, because they were still worried about the shoulder dystocia or whatever it's called.
Yeah. No, that makes sense because, I mean, pushing them out is hard. So if you get limb things in the way, you don't want to risk that at all.
And I think actually like after you've had one C-section, I mean, you can have VBACs, but then that also comes with complications.
Yeah.
So, and it's all I could handle at the time. And I think too, part of it is like taking some of the uncertainty out of it. But in America, we also have a problem with C-sections. So
Really?
there's an increased rate of C-sections is what I mean. Like we have too many.
Yeah, I was going to say, because there's loads of people that get yes, there's a lot of
but they're saying we do too many of them. But some for not the appropriate reasons. Mine were like having a stillbirth and then a subsequent pregnancy could be an appropriate reason to have a C-section, to have that more controlled experience emotionally, which a lot of women opt for. Mine was also because of the previous birth injury that could have happened to the babies in the subsequent pregnancies.
Yeah. I mean, I know some women opt for it because they're like, I don't want to push it out of there, and you're like,
yeah, well, that's what it's made for. I had a vaginal birth with Nora, and actually, I would have preferred a vaginal birth with both of them if I would have known the outcome, my subsequent babies, but I didn't, because there are benefits and there's neither good nor bad to either birth, but like you get this flood of hormones through a vaginal birth, which are pretty amazing too.
Yeah, I mean, when you've got food poisoning at the same time, they're not as effective, I can tell you that. But with my second, I had an all natural birth, and that was amazing. Like the adrenaline, I can tell you, that was handy stuff. I felt so good.
I think your body's supposed to work in a certain way, but the problem with childbirth for centuries is that it's always come with its dangers.
Yeah, always. And unfortunately, it's not just a danger to the baby, it's sometimes a danger to us too. Which I'm sure you've had many clients with that trauma as well, like where they've had a risk to themselves too.
I've had friends and clients, and that also is another layer, like we were talking about before, these layers. Like I could have died, I almost died, and my baby died, and I'm grieving my baby. So like, how do you sort all of that out? That's a lot to process.
So many layers. Yeah. Before we wrap up, is there anything that you want to tell anyone or advice you would give, just if for anyone who's going through this process right now, who's in this loss space, headspace right now?
I mean, the two messages I usually leave with is like, it helped me to think of my grief as just love, not my trauma, but my grief was just the love, as they say, longing for a place to go and to be and connect with Nora. So connecting with Nora and sending that grief as love to her was probably the most healing thing I could do. And so I help clients find that for themselves or their version of that. Keeping that connection with their baby that died is really important, whatever that looks like. Even as someone who's more agnostic or atheist, like I still felt like connected to her in nature and in the wind and believed in signs and things like that. So we're all connected. And so I think it's important to remember that we're still connected to our babies that died. Even like, the whole, I can never say it right, like microchurism, this idea is that our cells float around, they still float around in us and our DNA are connected. And I even like to think about how like Nora's DNA is probably still mingling in some of my children as well. So they're all connected. And that's what I really like to leave my clients with. And then the other piece is when you're subsequently pregnant, if you can't hold hope for yourself, which is fine, there's a community out there that can hold hope for you.
That's really beautiful.
Oh, thanks.
It's so important too, because not all women can hold that hope for themselves, and not all women.
I wasn't able to. And so I had to let my community do it.
So you didn't have that hope either during the pregnancies?
No, that's why I created pregnancy after loss support, so that people could feel, because a lot of times even my sister, who wasn't a mom yet, was like, why aren't you excited for this next baby? I'm like, because I'm terrified. Also, like, I am hopeful, little bit, a part of me is a little bit hopeful, but it's too scary to be hopeful like I was last time.
Yeah, that's fair.
And that's okay.
I've been trying to let myself feel it, and because I already have children here, my daughter is just like very into the baby and the fact that it's a girl and she's gonna have a sister, and she's all like, it's gonna be amazing. And So but there's always that little pang of kind of like, I'm so terrified that this is going to end badly and you're going to be crushed, but there is a lot more hope because they're kind of putting it on me. And they're like, let's have pancakes, let's celebrate, let's do a fun thing for the baby. I'm like, okay.
So yeah, sometimes my clients recently have had a hard time hanging onto that hope after multiple recurrent losses. Her 4-year-old really holds that hope for her. And I'm like, if you can't have it, that's okay. I think it will come, and we can delight in your 4-year-old having hope.
Yeah. I've kind of, at first I was like, am I allowed to let her have that? And then I was like, yeah, she's allowed to have that hope, but my kids can have that hope. If they want to believe that and have that hope, then that's good. And I'll just, I'll deal with whatever I have to deal with emotionally myself. But yeah, watching them have so much hope does pull you in a little bit, like to that hope.
Yeah, it's also the part of you that wants to have hope, right? Like you're projecting when you're like, can I let you hope that much? You're actually talking about yourself, right? And so it's kind of like a mirror to like, this is what you can do. And, once I got to about 30 weeks, my therapist was like, Lindsey, or maybe it was like 32 weeks, but what if something happened? Because I was very detached from Zoe's pregnancy. So I was afraid. And there's a term for that. It's called emotional cushioning. And people fear that like if you're too detached, you're not bonding with baby. But emotional cushioning research actually shows because you're detaching, you're actually already subconsciously or consciously attached. And that's why you're detaching. So if you're worried about it, you're actually not detached. So choosing little moments of hope can be good, like when you're delighting in your daughter's hope. But my therapist at 30 weeks was like, well, what if this baby dies too? So it was like that challenge of we can also go back and forth of trying to really connect to the baby and put a little toe in the water of risk, right? Of like, what if something bad happens? But then you also have those moments, you love this baby already. So it's okay to take little moments of delighting in that love and then going back to the shore of being like cautious as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That again, the mixture of emotions and kind of understanding that you can feel like everything at once, and feel very strongly.
And you can take turns. Yeah, and you can take turns.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for speaking with me, and I'm so glad that you had your children, your two beautiful kids, and I'm so sorry about Nora.
Thank you.
And thank you for starting the community that you started, and actually having that kind of resource available for women, because it really is hard to move through this season of pregnancy after loss. And I honestly was like all the other women who are like, no, I just need to have another baby, and you just don't know, you don't realize how hard it is until you're in it.
Yeah, and it's a complex emotional experience. And I'm glad that so much support and awareness has evolved around it in the last 10 years since I've been in the community. So thank you for doing what you're doing as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much for speaking with me. And hopefully we'll see you again in the lives and in the chats and stuff. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye. Please note that all speakers, including experts and professionals, express information, views, and opinions that should not be used to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any medical conditions. If you have a medical issue, please consult a qualified professional. Speakers voice their own views, opinions, and conclusions, and they may not reflect the views, opinions, and conclusions of other speakers. Ella Rose, The Joy of Sunflowers, and its sponsors may not endorse all or any of the views, opinions, or conclusions expressed.